Okay, it is the top of the hour, so we will go ahead and get started. I'm sure others will be joining us soon. So thank you for being here today for this webinar titled Skills for Navigating a Tech-Based Learning Ecosystem. It's presented today by Smarter Services, who is the provider of the Smarter Measure Learning Readiness Indicator in collaboration with Western Governors University, and we certainly thank them for their collaboration in this project. As others are logging in, let's be mindful of a few housekeeping items. Remember that this is a webinar, so all lines are muted, but chat is open, right? And we encourage you to use that chat just to make a comment on something that you hear, and other attendees may choose to make a comment back. Or if you have a question, please pose it there in chat. I have a couple of my comments who are monitoring chat, and we will make sure that all of the questions are addressed at the end of the presentation. You may look at your chat dialog box and make sure that you change the setting from all panelists to all attendees so that everyone today can see your chat comments. There will be a recording of the presentation sent out. Within a couple of days after the webinar, you'll receive an email from Smarter Services that not only contains the recording of the webinar, but has links to any of the resources that are mentioned and has links to some other relevant resources as well. So what we'll be doing today, I'll be providing this welcome, and then I'll be introducing our speaker today. After his comments, I'll have just a few minutes of comments, and then we'll wrap this up with a question and answer period. Hi, I'm Dr. Mac Adkins. I'm the founder and chief academic officer here with Smarter Services, and I'm pleased to have been collaborating over the last few weeks with our panelists today, Dr. Omid Fotuhi. He's the director of the College Innovation Network for Western Governors University, and we certainly enjoy collaborating with WGU as a client. I recently saw a publication that they released that contained this comment, and I was just so fascinated by it. I said, I've got to share that with our clients. So that's what we're doing here today, is allowing him to share this data that he and his colleagues collected over the past period of time. If you are new to us, Smarter Services provides two different services. Smarter Measure is an assessment that quantifies student readiness based on non-cognitive indicators of success. Those are things like motivation, procrastination, willingness to ask for help, locus of control, coupled with skills such as technology skills, on-screen reading skills, and keyboarding skills. We also provide smarter proctoring. Just like other proctoring companies, we provide virtual proctoring, which includes fully automated virtual proctoring, record and review, as well as live virtual proctoring. But in addition to those virtual proctoring modalities, we also manage face-to-face proctoring modalities, such as collegiate or professional testing centers, proctoring professionals such as pastors at churches or librarians. And we have a brand new modality that really evolved out of the pandemic called hybrid virtual proctoring, through which someone at your institution, typically a testing center employee, is the person who is doing the live virtual proctoring. So if you have proctoring needs, I know many of our schools are evaluating their proctoring practices now that we're approaching 3 years out of the pandemic. We'd love to talk to you about what we provide with Smarter Proctoring as well as Smarter Measure. So thank you for joining us today. I will pause. Let's change our screen sharing here. Let me stop sharing, and Omid can begin sharing.
Okay, let's hope this goes well. With any luck, you will all be seeing the slide that was just visible to you a second ago. Thank you for setting up this group, this conversation, and for letting us share some of the insights that we've captured and gathered and have been thinking about for the past few years. I'd like to start off by giving a very quick background of my approach and my training, which I think will help to inform how and why we're here talking about these conversations and these topics. So I am a social psychologist, and usually when I mention this to people, I'll get one of two reactions. Either people will self-disclose way too much, thinking that I'm a clinical psychologist, or they will shut down and stop talking altogether, thinking that I'm analyzing them. And while this is sort of a, it's sort of an occupational hazard in terms of not making me very popular at parties, it's actually a very useful skill set that I apply in the work that I do all the time. And specifically, the core skill that I do apply is always being able to explore and invest decisions based on the perspectives of the individuals that are experiencing whatever domain we think is relevant. With technology, I think it's one of those domains that's actually quite challenging to think about the impact of technology from a subjective lens. But that's really where I try to emphasize the value and the importance of being consistent with being able to do that and have that commitment. So that's a little bit about my background and my bias in terms of how it is that we think about technology and learning. It also has implications for what we're going to be talking about today, which has to do with the digital divide. As a spoiler, we began a number of research collaborations and projects at the dawn of the pandemic, when things began to convert to remote learning. And there was a lot of conversation around the digital divide and its likely negative impact on particular groups of students. What we've learned over the past 2 years is that while there still are facets of inequity and inequality, that those look actually quite different based on the data than what we might have predicted and expected. And there's nuance that's really important, especially as it interacts with technology. And I'd love to spend some time at the end of the session to explore what that is. But for the focus of the conversation today, we do want to talk about a key insight that we stumbled across in our work. What I want to talk about today really is work that has been in development for a couple of years. And here you see the lead researcher, Dr. Nicole Barbero, and our communications manager with the College Innovation Network, who did pioneer and lead a lot of this work. And so while she can't be here today, I do want to just give some credit where credit is due, and tell you about a key insight that we have been thinking about. And this has to do with a concept and a construct that we were testing for and measuring for, and we thought it would be an interesting complement to some of the other facets related to how students interact with technology, but in reality it ended up being a core determinant of students' experiences, and that is what we're calling EdTech self-efficacy. This is a construct that we basically were able to develop and formulate based on a pattern of responses that students have. But essentially, it's defined as a student's confidence in their ability to learn and adapt to technology in the classroom. Now, if any of you are familiar with the growth mindset principle, the sort of the set of beliefs that people have about the nature of their own intelligence and the nature of their own ability, as we know from that literature, that having a growth mindset, believing that you can acquire new abilities and strengthen your intelligence, has a series of very predictable positive outcomes. We're finding very similar kind of patterns with this EdTech mindset or EdTech self-efficacy in the research that we've been conducting for the past few years. So where was this research done? Let me take a second to tell you about the College Innovation Network. It is a fully funded research collaboration that was, again, born in 2019, just at the cusp of the pandemic. We were in full-scale implementation at the very beginnings of the pandemic. And within that time, in the time that we've been doing this work, we have worked with well over a dozen higher ed institutions, 10 of which have consistently done some research with us, especially around EdTech surveys. Collectively, those schools and those systems of schools represent close to 250,000 of college students around the nation. And we've conducted over 8 research projects in the network during the 2021-2022 period. So what the College Innovation Network is really an intentional approach to understanding what are students' evolving needs as it relates to technology. B, what are the forces that help to influence, both impact and impede the sourcing and implementation of relevant technologies? And C, how is it that you can evaluate those technologies in a way that's meaningful? So the EdTech surveys that we've conducted were really born to try to capture the full series of experiences from as many perspectives as we could garner to understand how technology impacts student learning in the current landscape. In our first survey, called the Student EdTech Survey, we did have a relatively good participation rate. And as you look at the breakdown of the participants, you see that we have a good number of diversity. So many students in the panel, in the sample, reported being low income, either or first gen. The percent, but the number of students who reported as female, and the number of individuals who were either mostly or fully online, as represented by these numbers here on the screen. And so a good array of diverse students across our students' EdTech surveys. Now, what I want to highlight just really quickly with this last slide is that in our surveys, we worked across a number of institutions, and some of them were sort of reactive and responsive to the pandemic, and so they had to adapt to the remote nature of learning, while others already had an online program, and so you could argue that they were almost prepared for online or remote modalities of learning. And one of the things we wanted to do was to compare how is it that these different kinds of institutions continue to serve their students, and the impact that the pandemic had on these students in the face of the remote learning. First thing I want to mention is that, unfortunately, not all students reported having a seamless or efficient transition to technology. We had about 20% of the students who reported struggling in some way to learn how to use their new technologies in their courses. That's not an insignificant number if you're looking at 1 in 5 students just not knowing how to navigate the basic channels needed to be able to access their learning. And a good 33% also reported that keeping up with all of the new tech and courses was difficult. You might recall at the very beginning, and maybe even currently, there seems to be an endless flow of new technological solutions that we're sort of bombarding faculty and students with to be able to, or be expected to adapt and adopt in a very quick manner. What we haven't been thinking about is, how is the experience of being confronted with all of these technologies actually impacting students' experiences? And so that's what we wanted to ask in our EdTech surveys. What we found, unfortunately, is that, again, students did seem to struggle, and that those who struggled the most, those who reported the greatest levels of challenge and difficulty, again, this notion of EdTech self-efficacy, also had a series of negative outcomes. So if you struggled to learn how to use EdTech, you were less likely to report that technology had the potential to enhance your learning experience. You were less likely to report that learning the course materials was something that you could do effectively in an online learning environment. If you had lower EdTech self-efficacy, you were more likely to report that you felt less connected. To lower EdTech self-efficacy, your ease and comfort with accessing the technology actually made it an impediment to feeling connected with your peers. And you're more likely to report that you would consider not enrolling in the subsequent semester. So if your interaction and experience with the technology itself, independent of the faculty or your peer connections or the content, seems to have this very powerful and consistent effect with what your general global academic experience and social experience consisted of. So the difficulty in managing and navigating the technology in front of you became the filter through which you experienced your academic and social experiences, because everything is sort of funneled through those channels. And what we realize is that unless you're able to understand and recognize and invest in those channels, that you might actually be sort of filtering out or blocking out access to many students who otherwise should be benefiting from a learning experience. That being said, and being consistent with that notion, we actually found some pretty powerful differences in these outcomes based on whether the institutions that the students were part of were either designed for online instruction, or whether they had to make a makeshift approach to adapting to online environments. So for students at colleges and universities that had to transition to online learning, those in the lighter blue bar, compared to those who are in primarily online university to begin with, in the blue bars, we find these lower levels of outcomes. So the greater likelihood of reporting that technologies enhanced my learning for those in the online universities, a greater likelihood to feel that I'm learning course content effectively, was a higher rating for those in online universities. And after a year of learning, I feel academically prepared for the next steps in my educational journey. Again, a difference between those who were already designed for online education versus those who had to transition to online modalities. And there's a powerful insight here. One is that there's a fair bit of work and investment that is made to get students and faculty to adapt to these channels. And importantly, that experience of adaptation plays a powerful influence on how students actually experience their learning experience and social experiences. It's important to note that in our work and speaking with students, we realize that much of their experience in terms of which technologies they were being asked to navigate and adapt and adopt to were largely informed by whatever decisions the faculty were making about which technologies to implement. So what we did in our second year of our program was to begin surveying the faculty across the College Innovation Network institutions. And we asked them some of the similar questions, but also wanted to know what are the factors that determine their decisions about which technologies to implement, what their perceptions are about what that technology has in terms of promising for students learning, and what it is that influences their perceptions and experiences with regards to their level of support from the administration. So in the faculty survey that was implemented in 2022, we had over 402 faculty respondents from across 8 different teaching institutions. Close to 60 were part-time faculty and 66 were female in this survey. What we ended up hearing from faculty is that they too struggled to integrate technologies into courses. Now, what's interesting is we had similar levels of challenges as the students. If you recall, students about 20% said that they struggled. Here we have close to about a 22% average, but spread across the kinds of institutions. And specifically what you're seeing is that those institutions that were already designed for online ended up having lower ratings of these perceived difficulties, whereas those who are not designed, the four-year colleges, tended to struggle most because these bureaucracies in large institutions that weren't set up for quick adaptation and for remote learning ended up encountering the most difficulties. And close to a third of the faculty in those four-year colleges reported having some challenges. They also were, interestingly enough, varying levels of confidence in their own abilities to teach an online environment. So a level of confidence in teaching through technology, where again, you kind of find a similar pattern across different institution types. So 95% of those who were teaching in online colleges reported having some level of fair bit of confidence in teaching online, whereas those in four-year colleges in comparison were the least likely to say that they had full confidence in being able to transfer and translate their teaching to an online experience. And what you kind of see happening and emerging is a perfect storm of students having a very difficult time navigating the technology that is the channel, that is the bridge between them and their learning. And as a result, feeling frustrated and feeling less efficacious in general to connect with their academics and their social groups. And at the same time, faculty also having that same difficulty of knowing how to navigate the various technologies and how to implement them as an effective conduit to be able to teach online in effective ways. And that these patterns are aggravated for those institutions that were not designed for online learning. An interesting, relevant topic is the perceived level of support that faculty experience or reported having. So in a question that asked faculty, am I rewarded by my department or college for using EdTech in my courses? Those in online colleges reported generally yes, so a quarter of them felt a clear sense of reward, whereas the lowest ratings again emerged in four-year colleges. So given these insights, given this understanding of how technology becomes a very powerful influence of how students actually navigate their learning and social connections, and understanding a little bit about the forces and the levers that impact a faculty member's decision about which technologies to implement and how that affects their learning, what are the general recommendations that we think are relevant to share? From a faculty's perspective, if we have any advice for them, we would say really try to invest in cycles that help you understand your students' experiences with technology and almost bake in a gradual process onboard their experiences with technology rather than making assumptions that they already have that know-how or that experience. So some of the strategies that faculty might consider is thinking about some surveys of your students at the beginning of the course to understand what are their levels of preparedness. I think Smarter Services probably has a suite of tools that could be relevant here, but specifically asking students about their general sense of readiness and comfort with navigating technology would be one of those very quick set of questions that you could ask your students at the beginning of your courses, and then knowing how to take those insights and understanding what are the issues that actually frustrate or prevent access. You know, we in WGRE Labs and those of us who are committed to the recognition of the importance of equity often will think about access as made up of two components. That in order to create accessible learning opportunities, you have to make sure that the content is indeed accessible. So in a universal and equitable way, that there are no systemic or systematic ways in which different groups have differential access to that same learning experience. But the second component is that you also want to make sure that access includes the content and resources being accessed. And that means being able to take the perspective of the students and understand why and how it is that they're actually engaging with the learning materials. So those two things, accessibility and being accessed, are a critical part of having learning environments that are accessible and have good access. So understanding what your students' needs are, understanding what are the barriers that prevents them from accessing those resources are critical, and then being able to address those gaps early. As we've mentioned with our self-efficacy findings, which was that these experiences with technology actually unfolded in ways that implied and had impact on how they saw themselves connecting socially and academically. But being able to create a sound, solid bridge that reliably connects students to those experiences is one of those things. And the earlier you can do that, the greater the continued access you're able to provide. And then the last thing is just understanding how learning happens, especially with novel domains, that you can't begin with a test. You have to begin with small learning experiences. And so the same is true with technology. You might want to begin with low stakes tech-based assignments or evaluations or interactions that allow students to gradually build the sense of self-efficacy that they need to navigate the technological tools and systems that are there. And so that's the one category, understand your students' experiences with technology. The second category is understanding that there are these dual learnings of EdTech and course content that we're all sort of falling into greater sense of comfort with, regardless of whether it's fully in person or fully online, that students are preferring this hybrid model of learning, and that may not go away for a while. And so thinking about how it is that we can leverage technology to increase equity and accessibility in a way that is really informed by the students' needs and their experiences. So how is it that you as a faculty can integrate EdTech learning into your course design? As you're thinking about your curriculum, as you're thinking about your evaluations, as you're thinking about the modalities of instruction, can technology play a role that complements what you're trying to achieve without necessarily falling prey to the old script that everything must be in person and in a traditional format? And so there's great opportunity here to explore innovations in creative ways. There are, again, just an exploration of having variable options for students to access issues or those with different levels of experience. So technology can be frustrating for some, but it can also be empowering for others. Imagine a student who may actually physically be quite distant from the campus. And so for them, understanding that they can access their learning through technology can be something that helps them be more likely to access it. So just understanding the differential needs that students have and accommodating those with technology. Again, as you're thinking about these dual learning modalities, being able to provide feedback early and often and addressing issues as early as often, and being proactive about the technological learnings that you want to implement and leverage. So a lot of this recommendation is understanding what your students' needs are, and then being able to be proactive to be able to address their needs. Our recommendations based on the insights from the faculty surveys, which goes to administrators and leaders, is also keeping in mind that faculty also are in a place where they need some of that support. So the first category is being able to provide support for using technology in an enhancing and innovative way. So can you as an administrator create systems of support for faculty to share new insights? What we know from the Rogers adoption curve, which we all have sort of seen and heard many times, is that there tends to be these early innovators, these late adopters, these resistors. But in reality, when you look at the group of individuals who are now in the new age of learning and education, and when we ask and survey these faculty, we find that a good proportion of them self-report as being innovators. The other thing that's important to know is that the way that influence happens is that the single most important source of influence that faculty have is not from their administrators, it's not from vendors, but it's from what other faculty members are doing. And so understanding that faculty are the greatest source of influence for each other are the ways that you can enhance the platforms in which faculty are able to share about their technologies and their learnings as a way of supporting each other and influencing greater implementation. Another category is really just trying to promote a culture of teaching, innovation, and collaboration, right? I think sometimes you get lost in the weeds, especially when so much technology is being thrown at you. But recognizing that at the end of the day, our mission is quite simple, which is to teach effectively, and thinking about technology in that light as an augmentation, not a replacement for teaching, and that can be one of the ways that you can really enhance the impact of faculty. And also being able to provide both the time and the training for faculty to use their technologies. I think some of the incentive structures and the resources necessary to be able to do this work effectively means carving out some space for faculty to be able to learn and play and experiment before things get rolled out. The other category is, and I've alluded to this already, is giving faculty a voice in the EdTech decisions and listening to what they need. Faculty often are quite motivated to create meaningful and satisfying learning experiences for students, But often they don't know that they have a voice at the table for decision making. That's why many of the times they end up choosing their own products or listening from what their peers are doing as a source of influence rather than implementing what the institution is trying to do. But if there was a way of creating a space for their voice and collaboration, then that might be a great first step to include faculty input and buy-in. An important thing of another important part of all of this is creating a culture where learning is quintessential. So being able to share feedback. If you know that a large percentage of your faculty are implementing new technologies, is there a venue and an affordance for them to come back and report what they've used and what they've learned? Or is that learning gone to waste? And finally, again, leveraging survey and research. Are there ways that you can create standard protocols to capture what faculty and students are going through so that you have your pulse on what is going on in emerging needs and abilities to be able to adjust those needs. So I do want to sort of take a pause. A lot more detail from our findings can be found in our report. If you have a phone, please feel free to pull it out, scan this QR code. That'll take you straight to a copy of our report. If you have any questions, you can always reach us through our labs website, but I'm also happy to spend some time here with you all and address any questions you might have.
Okay, thank you, Omid. That was really interesting and really informative, and I'm sure we're all thinking about how does this relate to my institution and what is the situation with my students and my faculty in regards to these questions as well. Some of you have posted some questions in chat. Please continue to do so. I've got just a couple of minutes of observation here, and then we'll speak to those questions that you've posted. So there's been a request to go back to the QR code. Let me do that right now. I'll put that up on the screen just for a moment. And again, everyone will be receiving an email within the next couple of days from us that will contain the slide deck. It will contain links to all resources referenced in the slide deck, as well as some other resources as well. So many of you guys on this webinar today are current institutions that use the Smarter Measure Learning Readiness Indicator, and you're very familiar with what we do and what we measure, and you know that really for about 18 years prior to the pandemic, we had been helping students and their schools answer the question, is e-learning a good fit for me? And that was the way the readiness question was framed. And so many times the Smarter Measure assessment was used to help a student make that modality decision. You know, which is the best fit for me, learning on campus or learning online? And so our assessment helped answer that question. Well, once we thought we had all the answers, they changed the question, right? So the pandemic made us reframe that learner readiness question, because during the pandemic, pretty much all institutions were offering online learning, some more prepared than others, as Omid referenced. But then now, as we emerge from the pandemic, many students are continuing to choose to learn online. Many courses are now a hybrid of on-campus and online, and even fully on-campus courses now are often making better use of instructional technology. So the learner readiness question now is perhaps best framed as, how can a student like me be successful learning online? And so that's what Smarter Measure does, is it helps the student understand their own traits, attributes, and skills. And that was something that Omid referenced during his presentation that's really helpful for students, is to understand their own capacity, their own background, their own level of preparation as they approach the learning event. Now, those of you who are our clients know that every year we put out a report. It's the annual National Means Report. And so you're about to look at one page of data from this most recent report. And what we do is we're looking at this data from hundreds of thousands of students from hundreds of institutions all over the country. And we're looking at the mean scores on several of these traits and attributes and skills that are measures of levels of readiness. Now, in this 2021 report, we did not just present data from that 1 year, because this 1 year in 2021 was really important because we were emerging from the pandemic. So we made it a 4-year longitudinal analysis where we looked at 2 years of baseline data prior to the pandemic. Then we looked at data during that academic year when we were all at home. And then we looked at 2021 data, which is when we emerged from it. Some really telling things in this data that's super parallel to all of the survey data that Omid just shared with you. First of all, when we look at volume. So this year, academic year 1920, this third one here, this was the year of the quarantine, right? And so there were more students took Smarter Measure that year than ever before, over 500,000 in 1 year. So that tells us more people were learning online. That's pretty obvious though, right? One of the questions that Smarter Measure asks students to report is, how many prior online courses have you had? Because a student may be new to your institution, but they're not new to online learning. And so it's on a scale of 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 or more. And so moving, before the pandemic, the national mean of that question was 1.7, right? Well, look at how it dropped during the pandemic. So just as Omid's survey pointed out, there were many, many persons brand new to learning in this technology-rich environment during the pandemic. The good news is now this mean is increased, obviously, after the pandemic, because more people have more experience in learning online. Now, these next 4 are skills, right, that we measure. We're measuring their own screen reading rate and recall, their technical knowledge, their technical competency, and their keyboarding abilities. And what's really, really telling in this data is that the lowest mean for all of these 4 years in the longitudinal analysis was during that quarantine year, right? So you see what the means were, very parallel, very consistent going into the pandemic, but then they dropped down. But the good news is they've bounced back a little bit. That may have something to do with choice. One of our attendees asked a question that we'll ask Omid to respond to in a moment about this matter of is a person choosing whether or not to learn online. And so we may be seeing some of that reflected in this data as we merge after the pandemic. But during the pandemic year, certainly technical skills were lower than they had ever been. Now, these last 4 things I'm going to show you, I shared this in a presentation recently, and an attendee said, that's both validating and depressing. So prepare yourself to be validated but depressed by this data. So what we're looking at here are some non-cognitive factors in these first 2 columns. Life factors, that's really what's going on in the student's environment, how many hours a week they're working, support from families, support from employers. It's a situation in life assessment, right? Individual attributes are things like motivation, control over procrastination, willingness to ask for help, locus of control, kind of that person's learning personality. Sadly enough, the national mean, now realize this is from hundreds of thousands of students at hundreds of institutions, the mean has been consistently dropping over these last 4 years. It's gone down from 79 to 77 for life factors. This is a 0 to 100 scale. Individual attributes down from 78 to 76. So even after the pandemic, this is not improving. So what you're hearing there is exactly what Omid's research was saying, was that for these non-cognitive traits and attributes and skills, who am I as a learner? That is more difficult for students now than it's ever been. Some people have asked me, well, Mac, you've been measuring learner readiness for, over 20 years now, and it used to be, is distance learning a good fit for me? Does this learner readiness question still matter? Oh, yeah. In fact, I think it matters more than ever because students are struggling in so many ways, and that's exactly what WGU's research pointed out. And then finally, the last depressing validating point of data, and this data is from your students that took Smarter Measure, is that their math readiness ability and their writing readiness ability has also consistently been declining over the last 4 years. Now, this first year of writing, we had a different scale then, the assessment was different, but these last 3 years, we've had a standardized assessment. And when you look at that, these mean scores are continuing to decline. So it's not great news about our students, right? They're struggling with their skills, they're struggling with their traits and their attributes, they're struggling with their math and writing abilities, and that's calling on us more than ever as institutions to support them exactly in the ways that Omid was talking about in his presentation. So I will pause there, and we're going to revisit some of your questions, one of which I know was about was geographic diversity factored in, or do you have any data from that where maybe students in rural areas or persons in geographic areas that may have, slower or less internet access? Did you do any sort of analysis about that and how that may have impacted what you were quantifying?
Yeah, we in our College Innovation Network group of institutions, we intentionally selected schools that were as diverse both demographically and geographically as possible. That being said, I'm very intentional and mindful of being able to make claims about geographic inferences that are based on samples. So just to say that we either did not have the sample sizes to make subgroup analyses on some of those measures based on rural versus urban populations, or nor did we have enough of a sample size to make geographic generalizations. But what we can tell you is from our observations across the different kinds of schools that that access to basic internet became a very pronounced issue for a lot of students. And that was pronounced more in rural settings. So as an example, one of our schools, recognizing that students were just having a hard time logging in, was able to create what they called as parking lot hotspots. And so they literally brought in these Wi-Fi nodes, set them up in the parking lots, recognizing that students can't access physical buildings anymore to access Wi-Fi, and that's what they depended on. So instead, they created these virtual remote parking lots that allowed students to come and access their Wi-Fi, where for many students that's what they were depending on. Another very clear recognition was that some students did, again, rely on their higher ed institutions to have access to physical computing devices. And so some of these schools decided to see if they could afford to buy and purchase hardware for students. And this, again, happened to be more in rural settings than urban settings. So those are the broad generalizations. I will say that as we continue to expand our sample sizes, we'll continue to look at some of these geographic differences, but I don't know that I'm ready to make claims about that based on the current samples that we have. I'm happy to answer any other questions, so if that's helpful.
Okay, thank you. For those of you who are Smarter Measure users, know that one set of the assessment for which you have data about your students is there is a technology access component of the assessment where we ask students questions like, how old is the computing device that you're using for class? Do you own it, or does someone else own it? We ask them to report their level of internet connectivity, if their connectivity is at home or if it's in a public place. So there is data you have about your students. If you would like us to help you analyze that data to draw some meaning from it, just reach out to your account manager, and they can reach out to me if needed. And that's what brings me joy, is to help you understand aspects about your students from the data we collect through Smarter Measure. Omid, there was another question asked about choice. Now that we're emerging from the pandemic and learners do have modality choices, to what degree do you think that's being impacted by this construct of ed tech self-efficacy?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are two independent questions there and interactive questions. One of the things that we know is as people were exposed and introduced to remote modalities, that they actually found the flexibility of modalities to serve their needs in differential ways. And that now we're finding that many institutions are seeing their students' retention rates go down. So what that means is that students are voting with their feet. They are going through the institutions and learning channels that best meets their needs. And that sometimes and often does mean being able to sort of break away from this notion that the only form of education is through the traditional brick and mortar, and are looking for institutions that offer more remote, more flexible learning opportunities and experiences. I'll share really quickly some findings that are emerging both in the workplace, but also are paralleled in some of our upcoming results, which is to say that when it comes to underserved and underrepresented groups, this counterintuitive finding that we're coming across is that there seems to be a preference for remote enabled working and learning experiences, especially for some of these underrepresented groups. And what that says is one of two things, one of which is that there may be varying levels of demands, like life demands, on different groups for whom the flexibility offers greater affordance to be able to manage both life demands and school and or work demands. But also that possibly the traditional models of work and school may not have been serving some of these groups as well as we had hoped. So I think, again, there's a recognition that now that there's an alternative, now that there's an option, we're seeing this flow of movement into different ways of learning and working. And that's a reflection of what actually meets individuals' needs. And I think we should be mindful of that. We should be mindful of those patterns. I'm trying to understand why that is, because that is a data point that we can use potentially to change the structures and the offerings that we have to really address the needs of the students who aren't feeling like their needs are being met otherwise. So that's what I'll say about that. I do think it's a really powerful and important point to be focused on. And I think we're seeing patterns that could potentially be signs of emerging trends even further down the line that we might want to be aware of.
Great. I have another comment to share, but before I do that, I want to pose a question to our attendees. And if some of you could respond via chat, I would really appreciate that. So this conversation has been about the fact that students are struggling now, right, to learn in this technology-rich environment. We've talked about the fact that we as educators, the burden is on us, whether that's faculty in the course or through the school, through support services, to really provide support to these students. So my question to you is, what is an avenue of support that you think is being impactful for your students? Maybe it's a redesigned orientation program, or maybe you have more tutors, or maybe you have some sort of peer support network among students, or maybe you've trained your faculty on how to recognize and individually support students who are struggling. But what is some of the avenues or the approaches that your school is doing now that you think is being successful in supporting students in this post-COVID environment? So while you're thinking about that, and again, post there in chat, we'd love to hear from you. I've got kind of a question or a comment for Omid. One of the things that really attracted me to this study when I read about it was the terminology that you came up with of ed tech self-efficacy. I like that as a title. What really drew to me was your definition, was that it drilled down into the person's confidence in using the technology. And I like that because the dualism of it, it's not just, do they know how to push the right buttons, but it's to what degree are they confident in their ability to push the right buttons. And so that's something that for years we've been measuring both sides of that construct with Smarter Measure, because we're getting at, you know, their individual attributes and those things about how they define themselves as a learner, and confidence is one of those constructs that we're looking at, coupled with their skill sets, because it takes both, right? A person may have more skill than they recognize, and that can impact their decision about whether or not to enroll. So while you guys are submitting some of your responses to your questions, I'd like for Omid to maybe reflect just a moment about maybe something about that definition that prompted them to come up with that.
Yeah, and I'll admit that, again, we weren't looking for this notion of tech self-efficacy. We were trying to capture different facets of how it is that students do interact and engage with technology, but we found a pretty clear pattern where there were reports relating to one's feelings or perceptions about one's abilities to be able to engage and learn new technologies. This reminds me of my father-in-law, for instance. very competent man in many domains, has learned to master new areas of expertise. And yet, for whatever reason, when it comes to technology, has convinced himself that he is incapable of learning new technologies. And because of that, when he sits down and there's a problem that emerges, that he becomes unrealistically frustrated. Not because the problem is difficult, but because in his mind, he's convinced himself that that challenge or that difficulty is an illustration that he cannot learn. And I think we take it for granted that there is a self-efficacy or a mindset component that really moderates, that really colors the way that students actually do or don't engage or interact with the technology that is intended to connect them to the learning. So I do think, as a broad message, to be able to separate both how it is that the educational content is accessed, but also how it is that students navigate the bridge that connects them to that educational content as being critically important for seeing relevant outcomes.
Thank you. Thank you guys for many of you putting several great ways that your school is responding. And we will share this, we'll export this chat thread, and that'll be one of the resources we'll share after the webinar. But I would like to put one of you on the spot if you would like to. This is Bethany Emery. Her comment was that they provide something called TILT, which is an acronym for Transparency in Teaching and Learning. It's a redesign of assessments. Bethany, I did enable you to speak if you'd like to. Would you like to describe a little bit about what that is?
I'm happy to. I will admit to you that my 50-year-old brain will definitely let me down as far as the researcher who started all this. This like is our idea. But it's really a process of just going back through your assignments, making sure that they show the purpose to the learner, as well as the step-by-step guides for how to work through the assignments, and really look at them through the lens of the student to say, what am I missing? Why is this challenging in ways that maybe it wouldn't have been challenging to me? And we had a lot of our faculty, especially when they were off campus and unable to get back on campus, these were just great discussions to be having. And because of the state we were in, everybody had to figure out how to get students better connected with the learning and the understanding. So that's where it all stemmed from. But if you do a quick search for TILT, Transparency in Teaching and Learning, there's a lot of research out there. It's really good stuff, we think.
Okay, tremendous. If you would shoot me an email with that link, and we'll share that with everyone in our post-webinar follow-up. And I will put, we've got just another minute or two, another one of our attendees on the spot, if he's willing to, Jairo Martinez. His comment was about at his institution, they require faculty and students to complete an online orientation course, and we love that. Probably the most common way that Smarter Measure is integrated at an institution is in the orientation course. And so we work with a lot of schools as they're designing their orientation courses to fit the assessment in, not so the student just takes the assessment, but that looking at their assessment scores is an integral part of that orientation course. And something I saw recently about orientation courses is that more and more schools are making these not just one and done experiences, but resources that are available to the student as they continue to be enrolled. And so I'll toss it over to Jairo. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but anything you'd like to say about your institution's approach to that orientation?
Right. So what we do usually is that every time we have a new semester of students coming in, or faculty members, we tend to just give them a new, enroll them in an online orientation through our LMS system. Usually having them do the simple things of navigating through the LMS, seeing what type of features they can get themselves in, just like I said, familiarizing themselves with the LMS system. Of course, if faculty members are the first time actually giving out an online course for the first time, we usually tend to give them workshops and have them be more engaged with what, when developing their courses given throughout this new semester. Like I said, it's very hands-on when we try to get these faculty members and students to be very familiarized with the LMS system or just online content in general.
Okay, great. Also interested in a comment shared by Heather Gouton, and I've given you ability to speak if you'd like to, Heather, but you're providing an efficient and consistent start here module. And I think that's so important for learners that are new to this learning modality of what do I do first? Because we know people that get discouraged in that first week are so much more likely to drop out. So Heather, anything you'd like to say about how you're structuring that?
Yeah, I would say it's more based off of what was talked about within the orientation, but it's just dedicated to the course. So really picking up on any specific ed tech that is utilized within that course and then giving them kind of like in the bare bones that they need to in order to get started within that ed tech. Just within that very first module. And we do try to keep it consistent throughout our courses, at least that layout of that first module, so that students build that understanding of where they need to go in order to kind of hit on that first tech instance for instead of going to potentially the teacher right off the way. And then very similar to the tilt principle, introducing as the course goes through scaffolds so that you start with really easy ways of introducing the ed tech, and then you build on those as you progress throughout the course.
Okay, tremendous. As I mentioned, we don't dictate where schools position Smarter Measure. Many do put it in the orientation course, but we've had some schools that actually position the assessment as a very, very early assignment in an academic course. One such course has been an English 101 course. Obviously, in that type course, the instructor would love to get a writing sample from the student to demonstrate their writing ability early on. So we've had some faculty that will administer Smarter Measure very first thing, first assignment in the course. So the student measures their own online learning readiness. And then the first assignment is to compose a 1 or 2 page paper reflecting on their levels of readiness. So that achieves a couple of things. One, it gives that English faculty a writing sample, but two, it really prompts the student to spend time with that score report and to be reflective on what is my level of readiness? Where do I stand when it comes to learning in this environment? So I thought that was a good approach as well. And the last person here I'll toss out to is Diane Shu. If you would like to comment, your comment was about having peer tutors and mentors and an active student success group. And my question for you is, in this peer mentoring and peer tutoring, obviously, students do that around subject matter. If you're struggling in writing or you're struggling, especially with math, have you seen any peer mentoring when it comes to this construct of ed tech self-efficacy? Are there any students that are strong with ed tech helping those who aren't?
Both of those topics are always a problem for students and have been all along. And we do incorporate options where they can be using like the read back from Word or a lot of other types of technology, not the services that you provide, but just using more computer-based activities. This has helped a lot. We're finding that no one wants to really come into a student success center and be seen. So it's really nice for them to be able to do a lot of the virtual meetings, and then they can do Kahoots and things like that to try to assist them, whether it's math, English, and I work at a nursing school. So it's a lot of science-based topics.
Okay, tremendous. Well, thank you guys for your comments. Again, we will export and share this chat string. Several of you had great comments there on what your schools are doing to support your students. And so glad to hear this because we're all in there together, right? Sure, we like retention for the numbers, but those retention numbers represent individual students. And something Smarter Services we're passionate about is that education is the best way to improve your life, right? And so we're all here to try to help students persist so that they can be successful and have improved lives. Omid, any closing comments you'd like to share?
No, I just want to thank you all for letting me be part of this conversation. I'm always enthused and excited to be part of a community that really is focusing on how to improve the experience of individual students. And it sounds like you all are very much committed to that. Happy to stay in touch. Please feel free to reach out. I have a LinkedIn, which is my form of social media that I will say I'm able to stay up to date with. And if there's any questions personally that you want to get my contact information, I'm sure that can be shared as well.
Yes, we'll share your contact information in our follow-up email. It will also include a survey. We'd love to hear from you about how useful or relevant you thought today's topic was, and we'll also give you an opportunity to propose other topics. About once per quarter or so, we provide these free webinars and try to bring in resource people that have something to add, and certainly Dr. Fotuhi did with his research today. So we're thankful for his time. We're thankful for your time. Have a great day.